Hello and welcome to the first part of the Sumerian Saga. Today we're going to explore how it was that men became ghosts and then returned to become builders, and by doing so, invented history. Now, for most of human history, people have been what you could call ghosts. They lived as nomadic groups, wandering from place to place, surviving off the land and adding nothing permanent to the landscape. As a result, we don't really know much about them. We can find their ghosts in the archaeological record, maybe in the tools they left behind, or the bones that are eventually eroded from the rocks that they once inhabited. But beyond these hints, there's little trace that they were ever here at all. But that changed around 6,000 years ago, when civilization emerged in Mesopotamia. Suddenly, humans became builders. They created things that lasted longer than their own lives. They built houses and temples and city walls, monumental constructions that acted as anchors to time. These buildings allowed succeeding generations to make their mark right on top of the last, turning the landscape into a canvas on which they could paint their story. This is how we went from ghosts to builders, and it happened in this place, Mesopotamia. The word Mesopotamia means the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, located in modern-day Iraq, Kuwait, and Turkey. Mesopotamia is home to some of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. And if you look at the map, you can see why. Because thanks to the rivers, it's green. And if you look through history, you can see that it's always been green, even during periods that elsewhere were extremely dry. So when the Ice Age ended around 12,000 years ago and the world started to get warmer, people began migrating to this area because it was an oasis amidst a desert. As they arrived, they found that the rivers provided everything they needed to survive: fish to eat, fertile soil to grow crops, reeds to build houses, wood for fuel. It was paradise. But there was a catch. The rivers would flood every year, washing away the soil and forcing people to abandon their villages and start over somewhere else. And so they kept moving, never staying in one place long enough to leave anything behind. They were ghosts. But over time, the people who lived in the region began to work out how to harness the flooding rivers, how to build dikes and canals and reservoirs. And this is what enabled them to stay put, to build something permanent in this place that the gods themselves had made. As soon as they did, history began. Today, the landscape is dotted with the remnants of those first cities, mounds of earth known as tells. If you fly over Mesopotamia, you can see them everywhere. From above, they look like natural features, small hills rising up out of the flat plains. But in reality, they're man-made. They grew larger with each passing generation. Each time a city was abandoned and a new one built on its ruins, the soil and the debris from the old buildings got layered on top, slowly building up the tell that still stands today. Some of these sites are as much as 75 meters high and contain the remains of dozens of cities from thousands of years apart. They're the physical embodiment of human activity. Over thousands of years, they became colossal, monumental, and beautiful. It was here, in this place, that men stopped being ghosts and became builders. But no site illustrates this transition better than Uruk. Now, the earliest settlements in the region date back to around 7000 BC. But the city of Uruk really took off around 4000 BC. That's when it went from being a small village of mud brick houses to one of the largest cities in the world. During its peak in the 26th century BC, it was home to around 80,000 people, which made it nearly twice the size of contemporary Rome. The streets were lined with enormous temples and palaces. There were craft workshops and administrative buildings, bakeries and slaughterhouses, everything that goes into making a city. It was also surrounded by a massive wall that measured 3 kilometers in circumference, which protected the inhabitants from invaders and wild animals alike. This transformation was so dramatic and so sudden that for the longest time, historians thought that Uruk must have been founded by a highly advanced civilization. Maybe it was aliens, or maybe the mythical Sumerians. But now we know that this wasn't the case. The transformation happened gradually, the result of hundreds of years of change. And yet, despite the gradualness of this process, the effects were immediate. In fact, the changes that occurred in Uruk didn't just affect Uruk. At the same time, cities were popping up all across the region. Kish, Yolagash, Isin, Larsa. All of these cities were growing rapidly and developing along the same lines. They were becoming centers of industry and agriculture. They were organizing large projects like irrigation systems and defensive walls. They were adopting similar political structures and administrative practices. They were basically becoming the same. And all of this happened within a single century, a century that scholars now refer to as the Uruk period, named after the city that best exemplifies what was happening across the region. This was a period of profound cultural change. It was a period that laid the foundation for everything that came after. It was a period that gave birth to civilization. So how did this happen? How did such a radical transformation occur so quickly? Well, we don't know exactly, but archaeologists have proposed a few theories. One is that around 4000 BC, a series of climatic shifts caused more people to migrate to the region, and this influx of people forced existing communities to grow and change. Another theory is that there was a technological breakthrough, specifically the invention of the plow. If true, this would have dramatically increased agricultural productivity, which in turn would have supported large populations. Then there's the theory that the temples were the engines of growth, that they drove both economic and population growth, which in turn led to urbanization. Whatever the reasons, we can be sure that the stage was set for civilization. The only thing that was missing was someone to build it. Now, before this period, most settlements in Mesopotamia were egalitarian, made up of extended families living in small villages and cooperating to build small-scale public works, like irrigation ditches. But this way of life was no longer viable. People were moving to the cities in unprecedented numbers, and the countryside was being worked by migrant laborers. This meant that society was becoming more specialized, more stratified. You had merchants and artisans and administrators, people whose jobs didn't consist of directly producing food. It was this specialization that allowed people to do things like build temples like the one that stood in the center of Uruk. It was huge, nearly a square kilometer in size, almost as large as the entire city of Pompeii. Built out of mud brick, it dominated the skyline. It was visible for miles. It was a constant reminder of the power of the institution that ran the city. Because in ancient Mesopotamia, the temple wasn't a place of worship, it was the place of government, the seat of authority. It was also the largest employer in the city, providing jobs for administrators, scribes, laborers, soldiers, priests. It was also the financial system. Taxes were collected in grain, which was stored in the temple and distributed to those who needed it. And since nobody was getting paid, not officially at least, the job basically amounted to servitude. But while the temple may have been the most important institution in the city, it wasn't alone. Alongside it were craft guilds, administrative organizations, palaces, private houses. All of these were buried beneath the modern streets of the city of Al-Ubaid. And if we're able to unearth these remains, it's only because the residents of Uruk accidentally destroyed them. Around 2600 BC, the city experienced a devastating flood. Most of the buildings burned down and the citizens were forced to flee. They left behind their homes and workshops, their palaces and temples, and they abandoned the city for nearly 200 years. But eventually they came back. When they did, they didn't rebuild the city on top of the old foundations. Instead, they leveled the ground and started anew, and in doing so, they erased the past. They lost the knowledge contained in the texts and tablets that once adorned the temple walls. They forgot the names of the kings who once held court in the great palaces. They discarded the foundations of the houses that once lined the streets. They covered over the tombs of the elite buried underneath the temple. To a certain extent, the people of Uruk were intentionally trying to break from their past. This was likely a response to the disasters that had befallen the city, perhaps an attempt to appease the gods and prevent another catastrophe. But it was also a natural byproduct of urbanization. When your city is constantly changing, when new districts are being built and old ones torn down, it's easy to lose track of time. Houses get destroyed and rebuilt, streets get renamed, neighborhoods get leveled and repurposed. In an environment like this, memory gets fragmented. Layers of history accumulate on top of each other, and the further down you go, the further back in time you go. That's why when the people of Uruk returned from exile, they didn't bother excavating all of the old material. It was easier and cheaper to simply build on top of it. So they dumped their trash on top of the city's trash, burying the remains of the past beneath the mud bricks of the future. Over time, the trash got compressed and turned to clay, solidifying the foundations of the new city. For 5 millennia, the people of Uruk kept returning to the same spot, rebuilding their city on top of the ruins of the last. And as they did, they buried the memories of the past, erasing the history of the people who once walked these streets. The question is, how did they get it back? Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe for more updates.